The gray November sky hung over Pine Creek with a leaden weight. The small Texas town, usually filled with the measured pace of provincial life, was shaken today by news that would soon spread to every home and fill the conversations in diners and bars. There had been a double murder at the sheriff's house. Detective Malone Flynn drove the police car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His partner, Joseph Sullivan, finished a conversation on the radio, clarifying the details of the call. Both men's faces were tense and anxious. A murder in a small town was always an extraordinary event, but when it involved the sheriff's family, the situation was doubly delicate. "The dispatcher confirmed it," Sullivan said grimly, turning off the radio. "The call came from Richardson himself. 2 bodies in his house. One of the victims is his wife, Julia." Malone nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the road. He had known Patrick Richardson for 8 years, ever since he transferred to the Pine Creek Police Department. Strict, principled, with an iron will, that was how his colleagues and fellow citizens saw the sheriff. "I never thought I'd be investigating a murder at Patrick's house," Malone said as he turned onto Oak Street, where the Richardsons' 2-story brick house was located. He always seemed like a man who had everything under control. "You know how it is," Sullivan replied, adjusting his tie as if preparing for an official meeting. "You never know what's going on behind closed doors." Heavy raindrops began to fall on the windshield as they parked in front of the house. Several police cars with their lights flashing were already lined up along the road. Yellow tape cordoned off the perimeter, and behind it, curious neighbors gathered, whispering and pointing at the house. News in Pine Creek spread faster than a forest fire. Officer Malik King, a young patrolman with a serious expression, met the detectives at the tape. "Detectives Flynn and Sullivan," he nodded, lifting the tape. "The sheriff's inside. He doesn't look good." "Who else is here?" Malone asked, pulling his raincoat hood over his head. "Coroner Rhodes arrived 10 minutes ago, and the crime scene techs are working," King replied, lowering his voice. "The second victim is a man, about 35 to 40 years old. Preliminary identification is Vincent Kelly, owner of a car repair shop on the west side." Sullivan frowned. "Kelly? I don't recall any connection between him and the sheriff." "That's why you're here, detectives," King said, pointing to the door. "This took us all by surprise." Malone felt his neck muscles tense. 8 years as a detective had taught him one thing: never jump to conclusions. But a feeling of unease was already creeping under his skin, like a cold wind blowing through the cracks of an old house. Inside, the organized chaos of a police investigation reigned. Photographers documented the crime scene, forensic technicians collected evidence, marking each find with yellow markers. But all that faded into the background when Malone saw the bodies. Julia Richardson lay in the center of the living room, her slender body twisted unnaturally, like a broken doll. A dark red stain spread across her light blue blouse, marking the spot where the bullet had entered. Her dark hair was scattered across the carpet, and her frozen eyes stared into nothingness. Malone had seen death often enough to know that this was the look people had when life left their bodies suddenly, without even enough time to realize what was happening. A few steps away from her lay a man, Vincent Kelly. His body was sprawled near the door leading to the hallway, face down, with a gunshot wound to the chest. The gun lay nearby, already marked as evidence. Patrick Richardson sat on the couch, his head in his hands. Next to him was a glass of water, which the sheriff hadn't even touched. His service weapon had already been taken away for examination. When the detectives approached, he slowly raised his head. Always collected and fit, the sheriff now looked broken, his face gaunt, his eyes red, his beard unshaven for 3 days. "Malone, Joseph," Richardson's voice sounded hoarse, as if he had been shouting for a long time. "Thank you for coming so quickly." "Patrick." Malone sat down carefully next to him, avoiding looking at Julia's body. "We need to know what happened. Can you tell us?" Richardson took a deep breath and tried to straighten up, but his shoulders slumped again under an invisible weight. "I got home earlier than usual, around 6 in the evening. Julia was supposed to make dinner." He paused for a moment, glancing at his wife's body, but then quickly turned back to the detectives. "When I opened the door, I heard a scream from the living room. I ran in and saw this man," the sheriff pointed with a trembling hand at Kelly's body, standing with a gun aimed at Julia. I didn't have time to scream. There was a shot and Julia... She fell. Richardson clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. I acted on instinct. I grabbed the gun and shot him right in the chest. He didn't even have time to turn toward me. He just fell where he stood. Sullivan methodically wrote down the statement in his notebook, glancing at the sheriff from time to time, gauging his reaction. "Are you familiar with Vincent Kelly?" Malone asked, trying to sound calm and professional, even though the man sitting in front of him was not just a witness, but a longtime colleague and, one might say, a friend. Richardson shook his head slowly. "Not personally. I know he has a car repair shop on the west side. I've seen him around town a couple of times, but we never spoke. Pine Creek is too small not to know people by name, but we weren't close." "Were there any conflicts between you? Maybe you fined his business, pulled him over for speeding, anything?" Malone continued. "Nothing." The sheriff rubbed his temple with his fingertips. "As far as I know, he never had any problems with the law. Just an ordinary citizen." "I don't understand." Richardson's voice faltered. "Why did he come to my house? Why did he kill Julia?" "Could Julia have known him?" Sullivan asked cautiously. "Maybe some business contacts, mutual friends?" Richardson frowned, thinking. "I don't think so. She never mentioned that name. Julia worked at an elementary school, teaching second grade. As far as I know, Kelly doesn't have any children, so it's unlikely they would have crossed paths at work." "Maybe he was looking for you," Malone suggested. "You're a sheriff. There must be people who hold a grudge." "Yes, but kill my wife?" Richardson shook his head. "That doesn't make sense. If he wanted revenge on me, it would have been easier to wait for me outside the station." Malone understood the logic in the sheriff's words. Indeed, if Kelly's target was Richardson himself, killing Julia seemed an illogical move. But crimes are not always logical. At that moment, Terrence Rhodes, a forensic expert with 20 years of experience, approached them. His serious expression suggested that he had information he did not want to share with the sheriff. "Detectives, can I talk to you privately?" Malone nodded and, turning to Richardson, said softly, "We'll be right back, Patrick. Hang in there." They moved toward the kitchen, where the sheriff couldn't hear them. "What's up, Terrence?" Malone asked, noticing how tense the usually unflappable expert looked. "Preliminary examination indicates that the woman died instantly. The bullet passed through her heart," Rhodes said quietly, in a professional tone. "Time of death was approximately between 5:30 and 6 p.m. The man died from a single gunshot wound to the chest, directly to the heart. Judging by everything, the shot was fired from close range." "The weapon?" Sullivan asked. "A semi-automatic pistol was found on the man, and preliminary findings indicate that it was used to kill Mrs. Richardson. The sheriff's service weapon was confiscated. Ballistics will confirm, but visually it appears that Kelly was killed with it." "So the sheriff's version is confirmed," Sullivan said thoughtfully. "Generally speaking, yes," Rhodes paused. "But there is one oddity. Judging by the position of the bodies, some time passed between the first and second shots. Not seconds, as one might assume if the sheriff had acted instinctively upon seeing someone shooting his wife." Malone frowned. "Are you sure?" "I'll say for sure after the autopsy, but the nature of the blood clotting and the position of the bodies indicate a pause. It's as if some time passed between the woman's death and the shot that killed the man. Maybe 2 or 3 minutes." "Shock, confusion," Malone suggested. "Patrick says he acted instinctively, but there's always a delay between realizing what's happening and reacting." "Possibly." Rhodes didn't look convinced. "In any case, we'll have a clearer picture after the lab tests. I'll send the bodies for autopsy as soon as possible." The forensic team continued to work methodically, collecting evidence, taking measurements, and photographing the crime scene from all angles. Malone and Sullivan walked around the house again, examining every detail. The front door showed no signs of forced entry, which confirmed the theory that either Julia had let Vincent in herself or the door had been left unlocked. Otherwise, the house looked normal, neat, cozy, with no signs of a struggle anywhere except the living room. The second floor had a bedroom, a study, and a guest room. There were no signs that Kelly had been there. The sheriff's office was perfectly organized. Folders with documents in the cabinet, a computer on the desk, family photos on the walls. Malone lingered, looking at one of them, Patrick and Julia against the backdrop of the sea, happy, smiling. Now this photo seemed like a frame from another life, irretrievably gone. When the bodies were taken away and the house was sealed off, Malone approached Richardson, who was still sitting in the police car, waiting to be allowed to leave. "Patrick, do you have a place to stay?" The sheriff nodded. "I'll go to Julia's sister's. She lives in the next town, Millfield." "Okay. We'll be in touch if we need any more information." Malone paused. "I'm so sorry, Patrick. We'll find answers." "Thanks, Malone," Richardson replied quietly. "I know you and Joseph will do everything you can." After the sheriff was taken away, the detectives went to the station. They had to start an investigation that they both felt would be far from straightforward. The atmosphere at the Pine Creek police station was tense. News of the tragedy at the sheriff's house spread among the staff, and everyone tried to cope with the shock in their own way. Some threw themselves into their work with redoubled zeal, others gathered in small groups, discussing what had happened in hushed voices. Malone and Sullivan took their places in the detective's shared office. Sullivan turned on his computer, ready to search for information about Vincent Kelly, while Malone headed for the coffee machine. Strong black coffee had become his faithful ally during his years on the police force, especially on days when the darkness of human deeds became too heavy a burden. "First, we need to find out everything we can about Vincent Kelly," Malone said, returning with 2 steaming cups. "Who is he? What did he do? Does he have a criminal record? Any connections to the Richardsons?" Sullivan was already typing queries into the database. Vincent Kelly, 36 years old. He began reading the information he had found. Born in Houston, moved to Pine Creek 12 years ago. He owns Kelly and Hopkins Auto Service with his partner Daryl Hopkins. He was married to Tamara Kelly, née Baker, divorced 3 years ago, no children. Criminal record? Fines? Complaints? Malone took a sip of coffee, wincing at its bitterness. Completely clean. Sullivan raised his eyebrows in surprise. Not even a parking ticket. Driver's license is in order, pays his taxes on time. A model citizen according to his records. "Too perfect," Malone muttered. "What about weapons? Anything registered to him?" Sullivan ran another check. "Yes, a Smith & Wesson semi-automatic pistol, registered to Vincent Kelly 3 years ago. Carrying permit is in order." 3 years ago? Around the time of the divorce, Malone noted. Maybe he was afraid of his ex-wife. Or maybe he bought it for business protection, Sullivan suggested. That's not the safest neighborhood in town. Do you have a list of his closest friends and relatives? His parents are dead. He has a mother who lives in Dallas, a sister in San Antonio, and a business partner, Daryl Hopkins. According to social media, they've been friends since high school. Let's start with him, Malone decided. It's always hard for parents to hear about the death of a child, even if they're over 30. It's better to talk to a friend first. Maybe he can shed some light on the situation. Malone and Sullivan drove to the auto repair shop, which was located in an industrial area on the western outskirts of the city. By this time, the rain had intensified, turning the road into a muddy stream, and the sky was covered with even thicker clouds, although it seemed that it couldn't get any darker. Kelly and Hopkins Auto Service looked like a typical auto repair shop, a large garage with lifts, an office area with glass windows, and a fence around the perimeter. Despite the late hour, the lights were on in the workshop. The detectives parked near the entrance, put on their raincoats, and headed inside. Daryl Hopkins was working on the engine of an old Ford when they entered. A tall, muscular man with short hair and impressive tattoos on his arms, he looked up at the sound of the door opening. Seeing the strangers in their formal suits, he tensed, instinctively straightening to his full height. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Hopkins' voice was wary but polite. Malone took out his badge and introduced himself. "Detectives Flynn and Sullivan, Pine Creek Police Department. We need to talk to you about Vincent Kelly." Daryl's face changed. His eyes widened. "Something happened to Vince? He hasn't answered his phone since lunchtime. I was starting to worry." Sullivan watched the man's reaction closely, noting the genuine concern in his eyes. "Unfortunately, we have some bad news, Mr. Hopkins," Malone said, pausing for effect. "Mr. Kelly died tonight." Daryl turned as pale as a person with his dark skin tone could possibly get. He slumped heavily into the nearest chair, the rag he had been wiping his hands with falling to the floor. Killed? How? How did this happen? An accident? He was shot in Sheriff Richardson's house after he killed his wife, Malone said bluntly, watching Hopkins's reaction closely. If he had expected to see any signs that Hopkins knew about his friend's plans, he was disappointed. Darryl looked completely stunned, his mouth hanging open in shock. "This is some kind of mistake," he said hoarsely. "Vince never. He wouldn't even kill a fly. He always let them out. He couldn't kill anyone, let alone the sheriff's wife. Why would he do that?" "Nevertheless, it happened," Sullivan said firmly. "Two witnesses examined the crime scene, and ballistics will confirm that Mrs. Richardson was killed with Mr. Kelly's gun. We need your help to understand why he did it." Darryl ran his hand through his short hair, then across his face, trying to collect his thoughts. "I don't understand," he repeated. "Why did Vince go to the sheriff's house? He never mentioned any problems with the law. We talked about everything." "Did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Kelly's behavior lately?" Malone asked, taking out his notebook. "Was he worried about something? Nervous? Having trouble sleeping?" Hopkins thought for a moment. He'd been a little distracted the last couple of months. Sometimes he'd zone out at work, forget what customers were saying to him. "I thought it was because of his divorce. He and Tamara split up 3 years ago, but they just finalized the papers recently. Vince was always sensitive, took things to heart. Did he mention Julia Richardson, maybe the sheriff? Did he have a conflict with any of them?" Malone continued. "No, never." Darryl shook his head firmly. "I swear, I'm not even sure he knew them personally." Pine Creek is a small town, but Vince wasn't particularly interested in local gossip or politics. He was focused on his work and his hobbies. "What were his hobbies?" Sullivan asked. "Fishing, mostly. He would sometimes go out to Madison Lake and spend the weekend there. He dreamed of opening a boat rental business there someday. He also collected old vinyl records and was a big jazz fan." Malone methodically wrote everything down, although none of these details shed any light on what had happened. "When was the last time you saw him?" "This morning, at the workshop. He worked until lunchtime, said he had to run some personal errands, and left around noon. He promised to be back by closing time to help with inventory, but he never showed up. I called him several times, but his phone was off." "Did he say where he was going?" Sullivan asked. "No, just personal business. Vince had become more secretive lately. Not aloof, but he was keeping something inside. I didn't press him, thinking he'd tell me when he was ready." Malone asked a few more questions, but Darryl seemed genuinely unaware of his friend's possible motives. He looked genuinely shocked and confused. "One last question, Mr. Hopkins," Malone said before leaving. "Did you know Vincent had a gun?" "Yes, he bought a pistol a couple of years ago for protection." Darryl nodded. "There are expensive tools in the workshop, and there have been thefts in the neighborhood. But he never carried it with him, kept it at home in a safe. At least that's what he said." The detectives left their business cards and asked Darryl to contact them if he remembered anything that might help with the investigation. When they returned to the car, it was already dark. The rain had intensified, drumming on the roof of the car with such ferocity that it seemed as if it wanted to pierce the metal. "What do you think?" Sullivan asked, turning the windshield wipers on full speed. Malone stared thoughtfully at the road. "It doesn't add up. Kelly was a respectable businessman with no criminal record, and suddenly he shows up at the sheriff's house and kills his wife? Why? From what Hopkins said, he wasn't a violent man. Maybe business problems? Could the sheriff have been putting pressure on his business? Possibly, but then why kill his wife and not the sheriff himself?" Malone shook his head. "It doesn't make sense. If Kelly had a conflict with Richardson, why didn't he wait until he came home?" Sullivan tapped his pen thoughtfully on his notepad. "What if Kelly was just crazy? Or was it some kind of personal vendetta against Julia? Maybe she was his school teacher and he had some childhood grudge against her." "That's too far-fetched," Malone said, unconvinced. "We need to check all of Kelly's connections to the Richardson family. Old sheriff cases, possible professional connections, mutual friends, everything. Back at the station, they buried themselves in paperwork. A check of Vincent's finances revealed nothing suspicious. A stable business with a steady income, no large debts or unexpected transactions. His phone records also seemed normal. Mostly calls to clients, suppliers, and Daryl. Nothing, Sullivan said disappointedly, leaning back in his chair. Not a single clue as to why this guy decided to kill the sheriff's wife. Malone silently scanned the forensic report. Ballistics confirmed that Julia had been killed with Vincent's gun, and Vincent himself had been killed with the sheriff's service pistol. The fingerprints on the weapons matched the version of events. "You know what's strange?" he finally said. "Richardson said he came home around 6 and immediately ran into Kelly, but the medical examiner determined Julia's time of death to be between 5:30 and 6 o'clock. If Kelly killed her shortly before the sheriff arrived, why did he stay in the house?" Sullivan shrugged. Maybe he was looking for something, or was he in shock from what he'd done? People who commit murder for the first time often freeze up. We've seen it before. "Maybe," Malone said uncertainly. "It just doesn't fit with the image of a cold-blooded killer who walks into a stranger's house with a gun. But we have all the evidence to back up Patrick's version," Sullivan said, gathering the papers into a folder. "The gun, the fingerprints, the time. It all makes sense. Kelly came to the sheriff's house with bad intentions, stumbled upon Julia and killed her. The sheriff caught him at the scene and shot him in self-defense. We may never know Kelly's motive, but the facts speak for themselves." Malone wanted to say something, but he was interrupted by a phone call. It was Lieutenant Baxter, their immediate superior. "How's the investigation into the murder at the sheriff's house going?" he asked without preamble. "Gathering information, sir," Malone replied, straightening his back as if the lieutenant could see him. "From what we can tell, Sheriff Richardson acted in self-defense after Vincent Kelly killed his wife." "Good." Baxter's voice sounded satisfied. "I want this case closed as soon as possible. You understand what I mean? The longer it drags on, the more gossip and speculation there will be. The sheriff is a respected man in this town, and I don't want his name dragged through the mud for no reason." Malone pursed his lips, glancing quickly at Sullivan, who pretended to be busy with his papers, but was clearly listening to the conversation. "With all due respect, sir, we must conduct a thorough investigation, regardless of who is involved," Malone said firmly. "I'm not saying ignore the procedures, Flynn, just don't drag it out. If all the evidence points to self-defense, close the case," the lieutenant said, hanging up. Malone put down the phone, feeling increasingly irritated. "Pressure from above," he muttered. "As if we're not professionals, as if we don't understand that this is a matter involving the sheriff." "Come on, Malone." Sullivan rolled his chair closer. "Baxter's right. All the evidence points to the sheriff acting in self-defense and within the law. Why drag it out?" "Because there are questions." Malone tapped his finger on the report. "Why did Kelly come? Why did he pick the Richardsons? And why did he stay in the house after Julia was killed?" Sullivan sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Sometimes we just don't have all the answers, buddy. And to be honest, my wife is 9 months pregnant, and I'd rather not spend the next 2 weeks digging into a case that's already been closed." Malone knew his partner wasn't just being lazy or trying to get out of work. Sullivan had always been a meticulous detective, carefully checking every angle. But he did have personal circumstances right now, and Malone couldn't blame him. "All right," he agreed reluctantly. "Let's write up a preliminary report and hold off on the final decision until tomorrow. Maybe the forensic team will find something else." They finished their paperwork around 11 o'clock. Rain was still pounding the windows, turning the streets of Pine Creek into rivers. Sullivan went home to his pregnant wife, and Malone decided to stop by Miller's Bar, the only place in town that was still open late. It was fairly empty inside. A few regulars sat at the bar, discussing sports with the bartender, Eddie Miller. When they saw Malone, the conversation stopped for a moment, then resumed with deliberate nonchalance. "Whiskey, double," Malone said curtly, settling into a tall bar stool. Eddie silently poured him a drink and walked to the other end of the bar. Malone knew that news of the tragedy at the sheriff's house had already spread throughout the town, and his presence aroused natural curiosity. But no one dared to ask the detective directly about the progress of the investigation. He took a sip of the burning drink, feeling the warmth spread through his body, driving away the damp chill of the rainy day. His thoughts returned to the murder. Something was bothering him, some detail he was missing. "Tough day, detective?" The voice that sounded nearby belonged to Malcolm Webster, the owner of the local pharmacy and a member of the city council. "Like everyone else in this town, Malcolm," Malone replied evasively. He wasn't in the mood for conversation, especially about the investigation. "A terrible tragedy," Webster shook his head. "I knew Julia since she was a child. Her father and I went to college together. She was a wonderful woman." Malone nodded, not knowing what to say. He avoided personal conversations about victims. It helped him maintain the professional distance necessary for an objective investigation. "And this guy, Kelly," Webster continued, taking a sip of his beer. "It was completely unexpected. He always seemed so quiet, decent." "Did you know him?" Malone asked, suddenly interested. "Not personally, but Pine Creek is a small town. He came to my pharmacy regularly for medication. Always polite, never any trouble." Malone pricked up his ears. "What kind of medicine, if you don't mind me asking?" "Well, mostly antiretroviral drugs. The guy had HIV, Webster said, realizing he might have said too much and looked embarrassed. "But that's confidential information, of course. Don't go around telling people." Malone felt a chill run down his spine. "How long has he been taking these drugs?" "About a year, maybe a little longer," Webster shrugged. "He's a regular customer, always paid on time, no problems." The detective made a mental note to check Kelly's medical history. If he really had HIV, could that be an important detail for the investigation? Was it somehow connected to the Richardsons? Or was it just a coincidence? "Thanks for the information, Malcolm." Malone finished his whiskey and placed several bills on the bar. "I think I'll be going. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Stepping outside, he stood under the bar's awning, looking at the rain-soaked streets of Pine Creek. The thought of Kelly's HIV status wouldn't leave him. It could be the key to understanding the motive that was so lacking in this case. That night, Malone couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in bed, remembering Patrick Richardson's face, his lost look, and the story that seemed so logical but still raised vague doubts. Something didn't add up. Some detail was slipping away from him, and that feeling wouldn't let him rest. Towards morning, when the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, Malone made a decision. He would conduct another investigation, interview the Richardsons' neighbors, and talk to Julia's friends. Perhaps the story was more complicated than it seemed at first glance. The next morning, Pine Creek was greeted by cold rain and heavy gray clouds. Detective Malone Flynn sat at his desk, looking at photos from the crime scene. Although all the evidence supported Sheriff Richardson's version of events, something inside Malone wouldn't let him rest. 20 years on the force had taught him to trust his instincts. Joseph Sullivan entered the office carrying 2 cups of coffee. His usually cheerful face looked tired. It had been a rough night for both detectives. "How's it going?" Sullivan asked, setting one of the cups in front of his partner. Malone rubbed his nose, fighting off the fatigue. "Something's not right here, Joseph. I can't put my finger on it, but I can feel it." Sullivan slumped heavily into his chair. "I know. I've been going over the sheriff's statement in my head all night. There are too many loose ends. Why did Kelly go to the Richardsons' house? Why did he choose that particular day? And why did he stay in the house after Julia was killed?" "Exactly." Malone took his coffee and took a big sip. "We need to dig deeper. I think we should talk to Julia's friends. Maybe she told them something about her life that even the sheriff doesn't know. Anyone in particular?" "Abigail Thompson." Malone took out his notebook. According to reports, she and Julia were close friends. They worked together at Oak Hills Elementary School. Plus, Abigail lives only 3 blocks away from the Richardsons' house. Sullivan nodded. "Good idea. When are we going?" "Right now. A double murder involving the sheriff can't wait." They left the police station and headed for Abigail Thompson's house. The small, neat, 1-story cottage with a well-kept, albeit rain-soaked garden looked cozy and welcoming. The detectives approached the door and knocked. The door was opened by a woman of about 33, thin, with short curly hair and tired eyes. Seeing the police, she swallowed nervously. "How can I help you?" Malone showed his badge. "Detectives Flynn and Sullivan. Are you Abigail Thompson?" The woman nodded, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to protect herself. "We're investigating the murder of Julia Richardson. May we come in?" Abigail silently stepped aside, letting them in. The living room was warm and cozy, with a half-finished cup of tea and an open book on the coffee table. "I knew you'd come," Abigail said quietly, gesturing toward the sofa. "It's all anyone in town is talking about. I still can't believe it." Her voice trembled. "We understand that this is difficult," Sullivan said, "but we need to ask you a few questions." Abigail nodded and sat down in a chair across from the detectives. "How long did you know Mrs. Richardson?" Malone began. "Almost 10 years. We met when I first moved to Pine Creek and started teaching. Julia helped me settle in." Abigail smiled faintly at the memory. She was an amazing person, caring, kind. The children adored her. "Were you close? Did she share her personal problems with you?" Abigail hesitated, as if weighing something in her mind. "Yes, we were like sisters, especially in the last few years when her marriage—" She fell silent. "Her marriage?" Sullivan prompted gently. Abigail sighed deeply. The last couple of years, her relationship with Patrick had been strained. He was always a tough man, demanding. His job as sheriff took up all his time and energy. Julia felt lonely. Malone leaned forward. "Lonely enough to seek comfort elsewhere?" Abigail's eyes widened in surprise. Then she lowered her gaze, nervously fingering the edge of her jacket. "You know," she said, barely audibly. "Not really," Malone replied. "It was just an assumption, which you just confirmed. Julia had an affair?" Abigail was silent for a long minute, then nodded. "Yes, for the last 6 months. She was seeing Vincent Kelly." Although the detectives had expected a twist like this, hearing it confirmed was shocking. Sullivan and Malone exchanged quick glances. "Are you sure?" Sullivan asked. "Vincent Kelly, the auto repair shop owner?" "Yes." Abigail looked broken under the weight of her confession. "They met when her car broke down last winter. Patrick was too busy to help, so she took it to Vincent's shop. They hit it off right away. A month later, it turned into something more." "And Patrick knew?" Malone asked. Julia swore he didn't. She was very careful. They would meet when Patrick was working the night shift, or Vincent would come over during the day when the sheriff was busy. Sometimes they would drive to a neighboring town so no one would see them together. "But it's hard to keep things like that secret in a small town," Sullivan remarked. "That's why I begged her to end it or divorce Patrick. But she was afraid. She said the sheriff would never let her go just like that." Abigail sighed convulsively. "Now I realize she was right." Malone frowned. "What do you mean? Isn't it obvious?" Abigail's eyes filled with tears. "Patrick found out about the affair and killed them both, and now he's passing it off as self-defense." "That's a serious accusation, Miss Thompson," Sullivan said sternly. "Do you have any proof? Other than what I knew about their relationship?" "No, but I know Patrick Richardson. He's a controlling, domineering man. He would never have let Julia leave him, especially for another man." "Is there anything else you can tell us about their relationship?" Malone asked. "Did Julia talk about any plans for the future? Maybe they were planning to move away together?" Abigail shook her head. "No, but Julia had been acting depressed for the last few weeks. A week ago, she came to me in tears, but refused to say what had happened. She just said she had serious problems, but she would deal with them herself." The detectives asked a few more questions, but didn't get any significant new information. Before leaving, Malone left Abigail his business card. "If you remember anything else that might help the investigation, please call." When they got back to the car, they were both silent, thinking over the information they had received. "This changes things," Sullivan finally said. "If Julia was having an affair with Kelly, the motives take on a whole new meaning." "Yes," Malone agreed. "Now we need to talk to the sheriff again. But first, let's check his alibi. He said he got home around 6, and according to Rhodes, Julia died between 5:30 and 6. There's a security camera across the street," Sullivan remembered. "Maybe it recorded when the sheriff actually came home." They headed for the Greenwood family home across the street from the sheriff's residence. Frederick Greenwood, an elderly man with a suspicious look, was not pleased to see the police, but after they explained, he agreed to show them the camera footage. "I installed them after thieves broke into the house next door last year," he explained, leading the detectives into his office. "The camera covers the entire street, including the driveway to the sheriff's house." They reviewed the footage from the previous day. At 4:35, Vincent Kelly's car was seen pulling up to the Richardsons' house. He stood there for a minute, clearly nervous, then got out and headed for the door. Julia let him in almost immediately, confirming Abigail's words about the affair. "Look," Malone pointed to the screen when the recording reached 5:20, the sheriff's patrol car. Sure enough, at exactly 5:20, Richardson's car pulled up to the house. The sheriff quickly got out and walked decisively toward the front door. Vincent was still in the house at that time. "Damn," Sullivan muttered. "He lied about the time he arrived. If he came back at 5:20 and Julia died between 5:30 and 6, then his whole story about finding Kelly shooting his wife is a lie," Malone finished. "He was there the whole time. Maybe he did catch them together and killed them both in a fit of rage. We need a search warrant for his home and office," Sullivan said decisively, "and we need to question him again immediately." They thanked Greenwood, made a copy of the tape, and went to Lieutenant Baxter for a warrant. He was shocked by the new facts, but quickly drew up the necessary documents. "Just be careful," he warned. "If the sheriff really killed 2 people and is trying to cover it up, he could be dangerous." Armed with the warrant, the detectives went to Julia's sister's house in Millfield, where Richardson was staying. Anita Parker, pale and grief-stricken, showed them into the guest room where the sheriff was sitting. Patrick Richardson looked broken. The stubble on his chin had grown thicker, his eyes were red, and his whole appearance spoke of extreme exhaustion. But when he saw the warrant in the detective's hands, his gaze suddenly became sharp and alert. "What's that?" he asked hoarsely. "A search warrant for your home and office, Sheriff," Malone replied, "and we need to ask you a few more questions, preferably at the station." Richardson rose slowly. "What's going on, Malone? I've told you everything I know." "Not everything, Patrick," Malone said softly. "We know about Julia and Vincent Kelly's affair." The sheriff froze, his face momentarily inscrutable, then asked with genuine surprise, "What are you talking about? What affair?" "We spoke to Abigail Thompson. She confirmed that Julia and Vincent had been seeing each other for the past 6 months." Richardson sank back into his chair, his face pale. That can't be true. Julia would never—" "We also have surveillance footage from a camera across the street from your house," Sullivan continued. "It shows that you didn't return home at 6 p.m. as you claimed, but at 5:20 p.m. Vincent Kelly was in the house at that time." The sheriff was silent, his gaze wandering around the room as if seeking escape from the reality that had come crashing down on him. "Patrick," Malone leaned toward him, "I've known you for many years. If you tell me the truth now, I'll do everything I can to help you. What happened last night?" Richardson looked up, and Malone saw pain in his eyes that was too deep to be just the result of losing his wife. "I don't know anything about an affair," the sheriff said quietly. "If it's true, God, I don't even know what to think. But I didn't lie about what happened last night. I really did see Kelly shoot Julia, and I shot him. Why did you lie about the time you arrived?" The sheriff hesitated. I arrived earlier, but I was sitting in my car. I was thinking about some things, talking on the phone. I didn't go into the house until around 6, just like I said." The detectives exchanged glances. The story sounded implausible. "Patrick, we can check your phone records," Malone said gently. "If you weren't talking to anyone at that time, your story won't hold up." "I'm not obligated to answer any more questions without a lawyer," Richardson said suddenly harshly. "Of course," Sullivan nodded, "but we'd still like you to come with us to the station." Richardson agreed, and they drove to the Pine Creek Police Department. On the way, the detectives contacted the team that was to search the sheriff's house and office. At the station, Richardson was placed in an interrogation room and given the opportunity to contact his lawyer. While he waited for his lawyer to arrive, Malone and Sullivan studied the results of the preliminary search. "Anything?" Malone asked Officer King. "Not yet, but we've only just started. Although—" King hesitated. "We found some prescription drugs in the medicine cabinet in the bathroom. Antiretroviral therapy, to be precise, prescribed to the sheriff. The prescription was written 2 weeks ago." Malone and Sullivan exchanged glances. "Antiretroviral? That's treatment for HIV," King finished for him. "Yes, the sheriff is undergoing treatment for HIV." This was a turn no one had expected. Malone immediately requested the medical records of all three: Patrick Richardson, Julia Richardson, and Vincent Kelly. While they waited for a response from the hospital, the sheriff's attorney, Marcus Banks, known in town for his toughness in court, arrived. "My client will not answer any questions about his medical condition," Banks declared as soon as he entered the interrogation room. "That's a violation of his right to privacy." "We're talking about a double murder, Mr. Banks," Malone replied. "In cases like this, medical information can be crucial to the investigation. Nevertheless, without a court order, my client is not obligated to discuss his health." The detectives left it at that for the time being, focusing on other aspects of the case. After several hours of questioning, during which Richardson stuck to his original story but adjusted the time of arrival, the detectives were brought the results of their request for medical records. "I have a warrant from Judge Montgomery," Malone said, entering the interrogation room with a folder in his hands. "It allows us to review your medical records, Sheriff." Richardson paled but said nothing. "According to these documents," Malone continued, reading from the folder, "you were diagnosed as HIV positive 2 weeks ago. Is that correct?" The sheriff nodded silently, his face impassive. "We also got access to the medical records of Julia Richardson and Vincent Kelly," Sullivan added. "Julia was also HIV positive. She was diagnosed 3 weeks ago. Kelly had been diagnosed over a year ago." A heavy silence hung in the room. "Patrick," Malone said softly, "I think now is the time to tell us what really happened yesterday." Richardson was silent for a long time, then looked at his lawyer as if asking for advice. Banks nodded slightly. "I found out about the diagnosis 2 weeks ago," the sheriff finally said, his voice sounding hollow as if he were underwater. "At first, I couldn't understand how I got infected, but the tests don't lie. When I asked Julia, she denied everything at first. Then she admitted that she had an episode with another man. She didn't name names, but she said it was a mistake, that it only happened once." The sheriff sighed deeply, his hands shaking. "I believed her. I told her we'd get through this, that we'd get treatment together. I really loved her, despite everything. But then," Richardson's voice broke. "Then I saw her phone. She had left it at home when she went to work. There were messages from Vincent Kelly, dozens of messages. I realized it wasn't just a fling. They had been having an affair behind my back." Malone nodded, encouraging the sheriff to continue. "I checked. I found out where he lived, learned about his diagnosis. It all fit. He infected her, and she infected me." The bitterness in Richardson's voice was almost palpable. "I decided to talk to her. I finished work early yesterday and came home. I planned to wait for Julia and have a serious talk. But when I pulled up to the house, I saw Kelly's car." Richardson paused, gathering his thoughts. "I sat in the car for almost an hour, unable to bring myself to go inside. I knew they were there, together, in my house, in my bed. When I finally went in, yes, it was around 5:20, I heard them talking. They were arguing. Julia was yelling at him about HIV, accusing him of infecting her on purpose. He denied it, saying he didn't know his status when they started dating." The sheriff's voice grew even quieter. "I stood in the hallway listening to my life fall apart. Then I went into the living room. They both froze when they saw me. Julia started saying something, trying to explain herself, but I wasn't listening. I took out my gun and fired. First at her, then at him. It all happened so fast, like a blur." "And then?" Sullivan asked. "Then I sat there with 2 dead bodies, not knowing what to do next. I made up a story about self-defense. I called the police and said I caught Kelly murdering Julia. Who would doubt the word of a sheriff?" Richardson looked up at the detectives. "I didn't plan this. I swear, I didn't want to kill anyone. But when I saw them together, heard their conversation, realized that they both knew about the illness and were hiding it from me. I just lost control." Malone nodded, feeling a heaviness in his chest. The man in front of him, whom he had known and respected for many years, had turned from a law enforcement officer into a criminal in an instant. "Patrick Richardson," Malone said in an official tone, "you are under arrest for the first-degree murder of Julia Richardson and Vincent Kelly." As the sheriff was led away, he paused for a moment beside Malone. "You know what's ironic? I'm going to die anyway. Maybe not from HIV. Medicine works wonders these days. But former sheriffs don't live long in prison. So in the end, they killed me anyway. After Richardson's arrest, a gloomy atmosphere reigned at the police station. All the officers were shocked by the sheriff's confession and the tragedy that had unfolded at his home. Malone and Sullivan sat in their office filling out reports. Neither of them felt any satisfaction from solving the case, only heaviness and fatigue. "You know," Sullivan finally said, putting down his pen, "I always thought our job was to catch bad guys, but sometimes good people do terrible things." "Richardson wasn't a good man," Malone replied. "A good man wouldn't have taken a gun and shot two unarmed people, no matter what the circumstances. But can you say with certainty that you wouldn't have snapped if you found out your wife was cheating on you and had given you a deadly disease?" Malone didn't answer. Deep down, he knew that no one could be sure how they would behave in an extreme situation. Not even a police officer with 20 years of experience. Not even a sheriff who had sworn to uphold the law. "All three of them paid a terrible price," he said finally. "Julia and Vincent with their lives, Patrick with his freedom and reputation. And all because of a few moments of weakness, a few wrong decisions," Sullivan added. They finished their reports in silence, mentally closing the case. But both knew that this story would haunt them for a long time, reminding them of how thin the line is between order and chaos, between law and crime, between love and hate.